Good morning. I've finished with my series on the World Championship between Ding and Nepo, so now it's the World Championship. Before that, which was between Carlsen and Nepo. The first 5 games were all draws. They weren't. They didn't just roll over and say draws. They were fighting draws, but neither of them really managed to make a chance. I think there was never more than about half a pawn difference between the two. And the match with very, very high standard of chess. And so now we come to the sixth game, which, for whatever reason, has often been a decisive game in the World Championship. And Carlsen has the white pieces and Nepo has the black pieces. It's a real mammoth game. And I'm going to leave the analysis on because it gets really complicated at times. And also, I just want to show how even it is for how long it is even. And of course, if you want to, you can stop the video and look at what it says on the analysis to give yourself an idea of what's going on. But it's better if you think out for yourself what's going on. Okay, the game takes place over many different phases, so we'll just get started with the first phase, which is, of course, the opening. Carlsen plays d4. I think in the match there'd been lots of, in the 5 games so far, there'd been a number of Catalans and a number of Roy Lopez. And this one gets called a pseudo-Catalan because he doesn't play the Catalan moves in the Catalan order. It's not quite exactly like the Catalan. But he plays knight to f3 and d5. That's symmetrical pawn opening. And when he plays g3, that's the Tarskova attack. e6, bishop's fianchettoed. The bishop comes to g7. A modest but solid move. Both sides castle. Perfectly good, safe positions for both. Carlsen plays b3 before playing c4, so that he's got that option for recapturing if the c pawn is captured, and also it gives him the opportunity to fianchetto his dark squared bishop. But it's a bit of an unusual move, and it gives Nepo the chance to play c5, so that he might actually be threatening to take on d5 and leave Carlsen with a bit of a poorer structure. But Carlsen takes, and Nepo takes back, and there are a good number of alternatives here, but the most simple, the most direct, and according to the computer the best, is just to play c4 and say, okay, well, how are we going to resolve this? Let's do it now. So it's taken, and Carlsen has choices. He can take with the queen, but then when he takes with the queen, he has to take back with the C pawn, the B pawn, and then he's left with an isolated C pawn and an isolated A pawn. So he doesn't want that structural damage. He could also have played knight to D4, but then that's a complicated pawn sacrifice that probably doesn't give anything, but it creates pressure on the B2 square. But he plays queen to C2 so that he can't take the pawn on B3 because it's pinned to the bishop. So he defends the bishop with queen c7, and the knight comes to d2, saying that if you take the pawn, I'm going to take it with the knight and attack your bishop twice, and then I'm going to be able to play bishop to b2 and have an attack on the knight, and this might be a more fruitful type of pawn sacrifice. So Nepo doesn't take it, and now takes the pawn back. You can see there's still a very, very even game. The knight is chased away. Again, there are opportunities. Knight b2, not very sensible. But he makes the best move, as he so often does. He plays knight c5. If he takes, when he takes back with the knight, he gets an attack on the rook on a7. So there are some threats going with there. But the knight comes to b4 and attacks the queen. Now the king is exposed if the knight gets to move. So the queen comes to b2. Yeah, it's a perfectly good move. And the bishop comes to b7, where it's defended by the queen. So there's a lot of tension in the position, but it's very, very even. And they just find a way of liquidating most of the material on the queen side, but not all of the material. The pawn comes to a3 to chase away the knight, which comes to c6, and the knight goes back to d3, threatens to take the bishop on c5 and thus gain the two bishops. Bishop retreats to b6 and the bishop comes to g5. So now he's threatening to take the pawn, take the bishop, and then that will damage Nepo's pawn structure, and it's unavoidable, really. Can't move the knight, of course, and it doesn't do any good to take with the queen, because then he just takes with the queen, and then he's in an endgame with a worse pawn structure. Not a place you want to be in a game against Magnus Carlsen. So the rook comes to d8, takes control of one of the only two open files on the board. And the swap is played, and he takes with the pawn. Yeah, okay. To avoid the queen ending. But still, this weakened pawn structure on the king side is a deciding factor in this game, but not for a long, long time. So the rook comes to c1, so that he's taking possession of the other open file. The knight comes to d4 to challenge this knight, and yeah, if he takes, then he can take the bishop here, and who knows. But he takes anyway, and he takes the bishop, he takes the knight instead of the bishop, threatens the queen at the same time, and the queen goes to a2, maybe a little bit out of the way, but it's good. Bishop takes, and the king takes, and it's still a completely even game, even although Nepo has a bishop against the knight. Nepo has a weaker pawn structure, and Carlsen has control over this open file. You could say that Nepo has control over this open file, but it isn't really so open with the bishop and the knight on it. So he plays queen to b7 check, and he plays king to g1. I thought that f3 might be best, but it isn't. It isn't. So, and the queen comes to threaten the e-pawn, defended by the queen, but he just gets his queen in a better position. Queen comes to c2, threatening to move the knight and attack the queen. The pawn comes to a5, and the rook comes to d1, fighting for control over the only other open file. King comes to g7, and the rook comes to d2. Excellent move, really, to support this pawn. Rook comes to c8, and Carlsen immediately takes it. So he's swapping two bishops for the rook. Now, in theory, two rooks for the queen. In theory, two rooks are worth 5 points each. That's 10, and a queen is worth 9 points. So, in theory, this is a slight material advantage to Carlsen, but it's getting these pieces well enough coordinated to get that advantage to work. And as you can see, the evaluation is a row of zeros, and a row of zeros for the best three moves for black here. So, and Nepo chooses the best of those moves, threatening a pawn on b3. And the pawn advances, so he's threatening to take here, in which case Carlsen would have to take with the pawn. If he takes with the knight, then bishop here check, and the rook falls. And even although rook and knight are worth almost as much as a queen, there's not enough in this situation. But there comes a couple of situations where he can weigh up, should I go for a a knight and queen. So I think we can safely say that once the queen is taken for the two rooks, we're deep into a middle game. Not an ending yet. There's one queen still on the board. Not a queenless middle game because there's one queen on the board. So we're in a middle game, not an ending, and there's a lot of manoeuvring, mainly aimed at dissolving the queenside pawns. If those 4 pawns on the queenside are swapped off for each other, then Carlsen has 4 pawns in 1 island against 4 pawns in 2 islands, and he has a pair of rooks against the queen. Both of these are permanent positional advantages, but both of them are probably not enough to make the game winnable. So Nepo pushes past b4 so that he's threatening to surround this pawn, and if he wins it he'll have a passed pawn. The bishop gets chased away, and the bishop comes first to e5. And he takes some space on the queen side with h4, on the king side with h4. Keeps the king out of the game as well, otherwise the king was threatening to wander in like this, or this, or this. Doesn't need to go here, but no, he doesn't have access to g5 square, so he can't invade. So, yeah, he plays h5. According to the machine, it's an inaccuracy, but it's a perfectly good, perfectly human move, and it's an inaccuracy that is not half a pawn worse than the best move. King comes to h2 to bolster up these pawns and to get off possible attacks on the diagonal. But it turns out to be in a vulnerable position here with this constellation, and it costs him. So the bishop comes to b2 and he's threatening to win a pawn, but it is a mistake. Carlsen plays c5, threatening the queen and threatening the pawn behind. Queen comes to d6, but it's only an inaccuracy if Carlsen finds exactly a right follow-up, which would not have been to win this pawn. It would have been to play the rook here, abandon this pawn, and then chase it away, and then win these 2 pawns. Yeah, sounds complicated, but it would, you see, 1.54, the first real chance for Carlsen in the game, but he doesn't see it, and I don't blame him for not seeing it. It's not a very human move, but actually the move he plays, Rook A1, has the same kind of idea. So he takes the pawn, and the rook takes the pawn, which, yeah, is fair enough. And the queen attacks the rook, and the rook comes to c5, where it is supported by the pawn and the knight. The pawn comes to e5. It probably would have been better just to take the pawn here. And the rook comes to c2, ready to double with c1 or rook d2. Queen comes to d5. He could have taken the pawn there, and that was the first real chance for Nepo. Could have taken the pawn, he could have gotten away with it. But no, the rook's double, and he can't get away with taking the pawn because the rooks support each other. And the queen threatens the rook, which is the best move. Of course, can't take, yeah, it's defended by the other rook, but it might be possible at some point to play bishop here, or bishop takes pawn. So the rook comes to a2 to threaten the bishop. And the pawn comes to e4, and this is first big mistake by Nepo. But Carlsen doesn't find the correct plan. The correct plan to exploit this is a bit inhuman, actually. He plays instead knight c5, which is good. That's the correct first move. And then the pawn is taken, and Carlsen he should have played rook d to c2 to defend the knight, and then concentrated on winning the pawn. He just wins the pawn back at once, and it goes back to zeros. But again, it's a fairly inhuman move, and again, it's playing the rook to c2. So he missed rook to c2 twice, but we can forgive him for that. And I think I think once this pawn is eliminated, we can definitely say we're in an endgame. An endgame full of pieces, and a very, very exciting theoretical material imbalance. But yeah, the rook comes to rook comes to c2, which is the best. So if we look at the material, Carlsen has 5, 10, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and Nepo has 1, 2, 3, 4, 13, 16. So theoretically, a pawn material advantage to Carlsen, but it is very difficult to coordinate these pieces, and for that reason it says that it's completely even. And also in compensation, Nepo does have the passed a pawn, which must be dealt with. He's willing to swap off straight, and then he can get both rooks here, and then he can look at winning the e-pawn. But at the minute, Carlsen is fighting for a draw. Let's put it that way. So the queen comes to double up on the attack on the knight, so that he's trying to play bishop takes, and then knight takes, and rook takes, and then queen takes rook. So you can't let that happen. So the knight comes to d3, where it has access to the squares, b2, and f4. Pawn comes to a3, and the knight comes to f4. He's attacking the pawn on a5 and h5, and putting his knight on a good active square where it can support a rook on e2, amongst other things. So queen comes to a5, and the rook comes to a2. He's getting ready to take that pawn. So the bishop attacks the rook, and the rook goes to e3. So the bishop and or the queen must keep defending that pawn at all times now. King comes to h6, tries to get involved in the game, and the rook comes to d1. He's maybe thinking about doubling up here, maybe thinking about playing rook here and knight here to here to here to here. He's looking at getting his knight on the c2 square, which is a little bit torturous. The queen comes to a4 and threatens the rook. The rook doubles up, and now the bishop has got to keep defending the pawn. If the bishop gives up sight of the pawn, then he will take. He's happy to swap off 2 rooks for the pawn, and then play with his 4 pawns against 3, knight against bishop. Probably still a drawish position. So the bishop comes to d6 to threaten the knight and keep its eye on the a3 pawn. The king moves out of the way, which is good, because otherwise, if we go back, if Carlsen moves the knight, goes on with his plan of moving the knight, then Nepo has queen takes pawn check, since the pawn is now pinned by the bishop. So he gets out of the pin, and the queen attacks the rook, and the knight begins its journey towards the c2 square. Queen comes to d3, and the knight comes to d4, looking next to get into the e2 square, the c2 square, so they can attack the pawn one more time. The king comes out of the way. That's to get out of the way of these possible checks on f5. And the king comes back to h2. I think really h g2 might have been better, but then the next move that Nepo plays would have been check, and he would have been forced to here, and then he might have been looking at some danger. So yeah, but now we have he takes the pawn, but it's a exchange of prisoners as it goes. He takes the pawn, but now Nepo exploits the pin on the g pawn to take the h pawn. So now we've got 3 pawns against 3 and 2 rooks against the queen. A knight and bishop. It's going to be said that a knight and rook coordinate nearly as well as a knight and queen, and Carlsen uses that coordination really well. So king comes to g1 so that he isn't exposed to any checks, and he's now threatening to take the queen. So now we can definitely say we're in an endgame, but this endgame is still more than 80 moves long. So, and yeah, Carlsen will try to keep his pieces together and organised, and yeah, try to make some advance with his pawn. He's also aware that if at some point in time he gets the opportunity to swap rook for bishop, then rook and knight are nearly worth a queen, and with the pawns for black being so much worse than the pawns for white, if he can manage that in the right circumstances, then it will be good for him. So he comes to e4, good square. Yeah, you can't argue with centralising the queen. And the rook is now threatened, so it comes to a4. And now he does a really good job of putting all his pieces on light squares. So knight comes to c2 and threatens the queen. So he can't take the rook on a1. So the queen comes to c2 and the rook comes to a2 and threatens the queen again. Queen comes to b3. So, alright, all these pieces, apart from the king, are on light squares where they can't be seen by the bishop, and his pawns are on dark squares where they restrain the opportunities for the bishop. This is an ideal kind of setup for this endgame, and the pieces really support one another really well. And the king comes also to a light coloured square where they defend things well. And the pawn comes to d5 check. I thought it might be an opportunity to play h4, but it doesn't work. E4, sorry, but it doesn't work as well in this circumstance because he just comes with a pawn. And then if he's got these 2 pawns against these 2, then that's much more even than these 3 pawns against these 3. So he can't do that yet, but he plays f3, which is good, but also it leads to a weakening of his pawns and less grip on the dark squares. So it's not all just straightforward. But now he comes to f4, restraining the bishop even more, but opening up his king to even more possible attacks on this diagonal and on the second rank and so on. So yeah, it doesn't all just plain sailing. So the bishop comes to c7, and the king comes to f2 to support the knight, so that the rook can go to a different square, possibly b2 to come to b7 or something like that. So the bishop comes to b6 to put pressure on this pawn so that he's threatening to come to b3 and d3 and threaten this pawn, and it will be no good putting the rook here because the bishop would then just take the pawn. So he chases the queen away, and the queen comes to b3 and attacks the pawn, and as I say, it's no good threatening the queen because the bishop just takes. So the rook comes to e4, king comes to g7, and the rook comes to e8. It's just as effective there. And actually, no, incredible though it might seem, there are He's actually trying to weave a mating net here, Carlsen. He's in danger of playing rook here, then rook here check, king's got to go here, then here, then rook here check, king's got to come back, rook here check, king's got to come back, and then rook here would be mate. So he's threatening a mating net, which forces Nepo into playing f5, which is a weakening of his position. It puts that pawn on a light coloured square where it can never be defended by the bishop. Must be defended by either the queen or the king at all times, which puts a big restraint on his opponent's possibilities. And the rook comes to e8. It isn't any longer a mate threat, but it's good how he manages to defend things and create attacking opportunities from so far away. The queen comes to b4. I think he might be threatening to play bishop here, queen here, and then he's going to be winning the knight, for example. So the rook comes to c8. Eventually, he might be looking at playing rook to c2. Yeah, so he's threatening now this business with queen here check. So even although we're in an endgame, and it's mainly about this unusual material imbalance, it doesn't stop either of them from playing attacking chess. Carlsen wins this game in magnificent style, but we mustn't forget what a good game Jan Nepomniatchi played. Got nothing for it, and it was probably really decisive in the match, but I think we've got to, it wasn't just brilliant Carlsen. Nepo played really well as well. Alright, it's a one move threat. Carlsen's not going to fall for that. But no, he's threatening to gang up on this pawn. So the rook must stay on the d file to preserve this pawn. So great, the rook comes to e5 where it attacks the c pawn, which can't be defended by anything other than the king now. And the queen comes to b3. Now he's threatening here. Alright, it's covered by the pawn, but it's a real threat. So the rook comes back to e8. The queen comes to d5. So that if the rook leaves the second rank, the queen can come to a1 and then play check here and maybe be winning something, which is one of the disadvantages of his earlier f4 move. But all the time, if he's got to make progress, he has to push these pawns. And there's another thing. There are three things which Carlsen has to balance in prosecuting this endgame. For the first, he has to make sure that he doesn't repeat the same position 3 times. Complicated position and easily done. The second is that he does have to not make any mistakes. He does have to not get in a position where he misses something and loses a piece or a pawn or anything. So he has to be vigilant with that all the time. And he has to be aware of the 50 move rule, that if it goes 50 moves without a piece being moved or a pawn being captured, then the game is automatically a draw. And we're now at queen h4. 53 was the last capture. So if there isn't a pawn pushed or a piece taken, then it's going to end up a draw. But pawn was pushed f5, so that gives us until move 114. Yeah, and I think that was the last pawn push for the moment. Anyway, so Nepo goes to d5 and he doubles up the rook. So it's not a mate threat anymore, but, he might, in theory, be able to check him here. get the rook here, win this pawn. He might. The queen comes to h1 now, so that she is threatened to come to h2, which with check, which would be good. So the rook comes back, defended by the knight. This is what I meant when I said that the rook and knight coordinate almost just as well as a queen and knight. Queen and knight really work beautifully together, but it's a rook, not a queen. So queen comes back to d5, and the rook comes to b1. Bishop comes to a7. This is an inaccuracy because it allows him to actually double up on here and attack the bishop and then maybe get this pawn. Because if he manages to swap both rooks and for the queen and this pawn, then again he will be having an advantage. How much of an advantage is difficult to say because it may be difficult to get these pieces to the squares where he can attack these pawns. The bishop might be able to restrain him from that, but yeah. So that was good. It was saying that attacking on e5 was best, and then this pawn is going to fall. Bishop comes to c5, and now he attacks on e5, but the pawn doesn't fall because the queen comes to d3. Doesn't just defend the pawn, but also attacks the rook. So the rook comes to b7, so that he might at some point be threatening to double up on here. Queen comes to c2, and the rook comes to b5. Bishop comes to a7. Rook comes to... I don't know why he didn't just take the pawn there. But he knows best. And he keeps harassing the rook. And now he takes the pawn. Why it was slightly better? No. Don't ask me. Way above my pay grade. I remember watching this on television. It was live on telly here in Norway. We have a brilliant commentator, international master, Torstein Bæ. Doesn't use any engine, just says what he thinks about the game. Talks really fast, really, really good. It was a really, really exciting game. And at the same time, I kept referring to Sese. Sese is a version of Stockfish, the newest version of Stockfish, run on really good computing facilities at the University of Trondheim. And so they're always get up and running whenever Carlsen plays something important. Then Sese will give you an evaluation, and it's not like the evaluation you see here, which is good, the evaluation from Stockfish, but it gives you a list of the moves and what each move scores. And for a lot of this game from now on, it's scoring a lot of moves as being 0-0. It scores all these moves in this position as 0-0 because it finds a better drawing move. It is better than Stockfish. Why is it better than Stockfish when Stockfish is best? Because it runs on so powerful equipment. And obviously the more powerful equipment you run the program on, the better results it gives. And it was exciting to see that, but so many moves were completely even. But as it got towards the end, it got more and more so that there were fewer and fewer moves which were completely even. Until eventually, when it comes to a crucial point, there were only two moves that were completely even, and he didn't find either of them. And by the time they get to move 130 something, they're living on the increment. They've been playing for 7 hours. A tiny little mistake is bound to happen, and this is what Carlsen is relying upon. So it comes to d3 and threatens the pawn. Remember, the threat with the bishop is probably more important than the threat with the knight, since he can't take. It's checked with the bishop, so he can't just defend with the rook here or with the rook here. I actually can defend with the rook here. So that if he takes with the bishop, no, because but then that would be a way of swapping the rook for the bishop, but he loses opponent with that. So he says check. He finds a different way of swapping the rook for a bishop, which gives him a pawn. He takes with the pawn, and then he says check, and then he wins the bishop. So now we've got a position where Carlsen has 8, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 against 9, 10. Theoretically, a pawn advantage, but it doesn't say that in the machine. Incidentally, if this pawn is swapped for this pawn, most likely candidate, then we have a position where there are only 7 pieces on the board, and this is a table base game. Table bases are something that computers use so that it's easier for them to agree draws. A table base is completely solved. If it's 6 pieces, you can put any 6 pieces you choose anywhere on the board, and the computer will tell you the result and the plan to get that result. And after the pawns are swapped, it's a table-based draw. It doesn't mean the game will be a draw. You've still got to find the correct moves, and the game still has more than 50 moves to go. So there will be a pawn move or a capture. Otherwise, it would be a draw. So queen comes to d5 again with this idea of playing queen to h1 and queen to h2 check. So he says check first to get the king further away from the pawn before playing rook to a1. Said that rook to b6 was best. I'm not quite sure what that's about. But rook to a1, excellent move. It's what I'd be playing. It's the human move. Keeps the king out. But the king just comes straight back. But now he gets to play his knight to d4. The queen comes to b7. And the rook comes to, because when he comes to b7 he was threatening to play queen here, check, and pick up the rook. So the rook comes to a2, where it defends this square, and where it has access to the squares c2 and e2, both protected by the knight. e2 probably favourable, because then that might give him the opportunity at some point in time to play d4, e4. So the queen comes to h1, and he says check first, and then he plays the knight to f3 to keep the queen out of this square. It's great. And if the queen wants to make progress and threaten us to come to the other side, so there's 2 sides from which the king can be attacked on the second rank. This is obviously the short side, and the knight and king together can keep the queen out of this short side, so it has to go to the long side. And this is the mistake when it came down to it. He went to the long side, and he should have gone to the other side. So this is perfectly correct. The rook comes to d6, so they can come here to close off the long side. King comes to g7, and he attacks the pawn first, and he checks, and the rook interposes. So he's not any longer attacking the pawn. Now the rook comes to d2, e2, supported by the king, and he will be at some point in the future in a position to play e4 and make some progress. So the queen comes to b6 to prevent the pawn from coming to e4, and the rook comes to c2 just to give itself a bit more scope. Queen comes to b1, and the knight comes to e4, d4 even, to support the rook. Does a great job of tying these pieces together all the time. Again, he's threatening rook, queen here, check. So he says check, says check again, and comes here with the knight again. Slightly different. The king's in a different position. This is one of the things that keeps it from being a repetition. And the queen comes back to b1. And the knight comes to g5 check. The king comes to g7. And the knight comes to e6 check, and the king comes to f7, and the knight comes to d4. So again, we're in the same position. And the queen comes to h1, check again, puts the king in a different position so that it won't be a repetition. Queen comes again to b1, and the rook comes to d7 to come here where it's supported by the the knight. Check, and the rook comes to b1. It's not a repetition, the king's on a different square. So queen comes to b1, and the knight comes to g1. Excellent. Another way of keeping the queen out of this square. And the rook is threatened, and the rook goes back, and he threatens the rook, and he also threatens to play queen to c2 check. He checks first, and then he comes to d4. Queen comes to b2, and the knight comes to e2 on a new square for the knight. Queen comes to b1, and eventually he's gotten the pawn forward. So that's move 110. He now has until move 160 to find mate. Queen comes to h1, threatening to play h2 check, but it's not such a serious threat now because he can play king to f3 and eventually king to e4, e3, and then he can get out of the checks whilst the knight defends the pawn. So he plays check first, and then he defends the pawn on e4. And the check is played, and the king comes to e4, where it's free from checks. He can't check here because of the knight, can't check here because of the king, and he can't check here because of the knight. So he has to find another way to come into the game. But he doesn't find another way to come into the game. Instead, he realizes that he has to open up the position more to allow his queen to keep giving these perpetual checks. Now we're just playing for two results. Either Nepomniatchi is going to hold the draw, or Carlsen is going to win. There's no win here for Nepo. It's not possible for him to win this game. But he pushes the pawn, and Carlsen takes it, opening up the whole of the third and first and second rank. So that's 24 possible checking squares for Nepo. He says check first instead of just taking the pawn straight away, and Carlsen comes to d2, and now he takes the pawn, and Carlsen comes to d3 so that he can. What he does really brilliantly in this endgame is he keeps these pieces very compact, very together, so that he's in a position to advance his pawns. King comes to f8, and the rook comes to f3. Queen comes to d8 check, and the king comes to e3, where he possibly can block the check with the knight. The queen comes to a5, threatening check here or here with the queen. King comes to f2 to give himself room to hide on the short side. Queen comes to a7 check. Even although it says plus 0.69 here, I think Sese is saying this is a complete draw, a row of zeros. And the rook blocks, so that, yeah, there's only checks on the second, third row on the short side, which is harder for him to use. So the queen comes to d7, and oh, sorry. So the queen comes to g7, and the knight comes to g3. And yeah, now he is in a position to push either of these pawns, and it'll be defended. And the queen comes to d2, and the king comes to f3. Queen comes to d1 check, and the rook comes to e2. He plays another check, and the king hides on this side. The two pawns are ready to push open, but it's still completely even. There is still a path to a draw but this is an inaccurate move. And yeah, saying he should play rook here instead of here, but I don't think it makes much difference. And yeah, that's the best move. The rook comes here. You might be thinking about coming here. The king comes forward. Rook says check. Rook says check again, and the pieces are wonderfully compact, and he might be able to hide his king over on this side somewhere. And he gets the chance to push another pawn. Queen comes to a2 check, which is, yeah, perfectly fine. And the king comes to h3 to try and escape in this direction. And the queen comes to e6 to pin the pawn. And that's a fatal mistake. He did, to pin the rook. He doesn't any longer have the same range of checks as he had. And the king comes to h4, of course. And the knight comes, and now this is 2.94. As you see, this is a winning position. Takes a few moves to play out. He threatens the rook. He plays the pawn. Great, because if he takes the rook, knight here check wins the queen. And then even if he loses this pawn, he will retain this pawn and he will win. So the queen comes to g6, which is great. Could have come to b7, but it doesn't make any difference. The difference between plus 7.05 and plus 3.53 is nothing because they're both winning advantages. Just this is more clearly when rook comes to f7, and now if he gets the knight here, he will be threatened to check. He will be threatened to push the pawn and then queen the pawn. So the king goes to d8, and he threatens the queen, and the queen comes to f5, and the knight comes to g7, and suddenly it says 16.4, mate in 18 actually, because now if he checks, he eventually runs by this route to this square here where he can't be checked, and then he plays pawn to e7 check, and we'll get a queen on the next move. And even if he covers it with his queen, then he's going to be giving up his queen for the rook and pawn, but he still got, Carlsen would still have knight and pawn, and that will be enough for him to win. So Nepomniatchi resigned after 7 hours and 136 moves, the longest game in the history of the World Chess Championship. And obviously, I'm a big Magnus Carlsen fan. I don't think I've ever made any secret of that. But I also like Jan Nepomniatchi as a player and as a person. I felt really, really sad for him because he looked a broken man after this game. And as chess players, we all know how painful it can be to lose a game of chess. And to lose a game of chess after 7 hours of this level of stress and 7 hours of playing such beautiful, accurate, and challenging chess for 7 hours, and then somewhere towards the end of the 7th hour making a tiny little perfectly human error, and suddenly it all crumbles for you. Really sad day for Jan Nepomniachtchi. And in the rest of the match, which I will be looking at, he never really recovered from this blow. I think it really could have taken him a year and a half to recover from this blow. And I was really glad that he won the next candidates, and the year after he began to show what a good chess player he is. Because, okay, I was shown he's a good chess player in this game, but the rest of the match, the wonderful chess player that Jan Nepomniachtchi is, didn't really show through. But, we just have to admire Carlsen, who, keeps going for 136 moves, keeps presenting a new problem for his opponent to solve, keeps his pieces well coordinated, well together, and manages to make a little bit of progress with his pawns all the time. And you try sitting there for 7 hours and finding the perfect move. Alright, when you've got 10 moves that are good, you find them, but when it gets down to just one or two in the 7th hour, You make mistakes. We're only human. Yeah. So a truly fantastic game by Magnus Carlsen. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, subscribe and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.